Hello everyone. Since the dawn of human culture, men have looked at the sky and observed all these mysterious celestial bodies that kept coming back every night and seemed to follow patterns. Groups of stars apparently traveling together and returning to the same position each year. The sun rising and disappearing each day. The moon following its own cycle of 28 days. And other bodies like planets or comets. But what were these? Were they shiny beings living in the skies? Or gems embedded in a celestial dome? And why did they move? It also appeared that the cycles of these objects in the sky corresponded to seasons and their weather patterns. Did that mean what happened on Earth was reflected in the sky, or the other way around? That the movement of celestial bodies influenced or determined what took place in our world? These are certainly some of the observations and questions that gave rise to both astronomy, the study of celestial objects, and astrology, the attempt to discern and predict information about human affairs and terrestrial events based on the apparent position of celestial objects. Actually, we will see that in many cultures around the world, astronomy and astrology were not formally separated until major breakthroughs in astronomy in modern times, starting in the 16th and 17th centuries, when it appeared that Earth was maybe not the center of the universe, and that all the stars and planets that seemed to fly around it were in fact other bodies following their own course in space. Astrology did not disappear. It adapted, but it lost its status of science, of academic discipline, at least in Western countries, and became one of many esoterical practices, with a certain popular success, especially since the 20th century, when it had a resurgence in the media. Undeniably, it has an appeal. So tonight, I will tell you about the long and sometimes surprising history of astrology. We will see the different forms this discipline took in various cultures, how they evolved with discoveries, how Western astrology, with its zodiac signs and concepts, formed, and also a few hypotheses about why so many people are drawn to it, even though they are sometimes skeptical that it really has predictive value. So this story is not going to be about whether astrology works or doesn't work. We're going to look at it from a historical and cultural point of view. Before we begin, take a short moment to relax and find a position in which you feel comfortable. You can close your eyes at any time, sleep during the story. You can always come back later. In the description and the first comment, you will find links to my Patreon page if you wish to support this channel and get the associated perks like surveys, early releases and announcements. You can also listen on Spotify, Apple Music and other platforms if this is more convenient for you. And finally, I invite you to check the channel and podcast Lights Out Library for the retelling of my stories by Sarah, edited and retold in an American accent. Our podcast is gaining traction, and this is encouraging. You can listen to it on YouTube or your usual podcast platform. There are also links in the pinned comment for that. Now, let the tension go in your shoulders. Breathe in and out. Our journey is about to begin. It is hard to know exactly when predictions began to be made using the position and movement of stars and planets. But it certainly started with the observation of cycles in the sky. The earliest evidence we have of an interest in the cycles of celestial objects dates back from 25,000 years ago. Markings on bones and prehistoric cave walls that tracked lunar cycles, probably the most obvious kind of cycle because they are relatively short, 28 days only, and the moon is often the most visible body in the night sky. Men could certainly notice the correspondence, the connection between these movements and natural phenomena, like tides for the moon, or the connection between seasons and their weather patterns with how high the sun rose in the sky. We ignore the meaning attributed to these patterns so long ago, if any, but these basic astronomical observations became particularly useful when human groups settled and adopted a sedentary lifestyle based on agriculture. This happened during the Neolithic agricultural revolution, which took place in different parts of the world more than 10,000 years ago. More and more groups transitioned from hunting and gathering to a life of settlement and agriculture, based on the domestication of plants that became crops and of animals. Agriculture implies planning. You need to know what time of the year is appropriate to plant seeds, and depending on the regions, you need to anticipate recurring phenomena like rain or floods to take advantage of them. This made astronomy a useful tool. Constellations of stars in particular that follow annual cycles in the sky could herald annual floods or seasonal activities. By the 3rd millennium BC, when urban civilizations emerged, they had developed awareness of celestial cycles of everything that was visible to the naked eye, and established the correspondence between these cycles and the seasons, the years, or the probability of weather events such as variations in temperature or rain. There was this practical dimension to it, but because we also are beings of culture and symbols of interpretation, causal links were established. We have proof of that, for example, in the alignment of temples, with the rising of stars, or with the position of certain bodies in the sky at pivotal moments in the year. Very old monuments, from Stonehenge to Egyptian pyramids or Sumerian temples, were not built randomly. Their orientation and maybe their architecture were filled with significance, with meaning, as if they were conceived as meeting points between our terrestrial world and what was above it. This tells us that the movement of celestial bodies was seen as much more than just practical information. It was also infused with meaning. Saying what meaning exactly is tricky for the very first civilizations. We can only speculate, because they did not let any explicit documents about their views, only ruins and scattered inscriptions sometimes. The connection between what happened in the sky, repeating fixed cycles, and terrestrial phenomena like seasons was obvious. And this probably explains why astrological beliefs appeared spontaneously, it seems, across the world, in cultures that were not in contact. These cultures elaborated astrological systems that were all different and sometimes contradictory. The same body, like a planet, could be attributed different influences or functions. But in parts of the world that were very far apart, these systems emerged and became used for divination, to understand the present or anticipate the future. If celestial bodies were connected to terrestrial life, and we can anticipate on the cycles of these bodies, then why not also study their possible influence and use it to make predictions about events, from people's lives to entire societies? Astrological systems can be very different, but this is their common starting point. The assumption or the belief that celestial objects determine or influence what happens on Earth, and will continue to do it in the future. The earliest recorded organized system of astrology is Babylonian astrology, and it arose in the 2nd millennium BC in Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq. The first recorded system or theory of astrology, but obviously it doesn't mean it did not exist before. We know that 1,000 years before, in the same region, the Sumerians made omens inspired by celestial observation. But references to these are isolated. It is not sufficient information to figure out what the Sumerians thought of astrology and how it was practiced. But from the Babylonians of the 2nd millennium BC, we have some written information, including a comprehensive compilation of 70 tablets, comprising thousands of celestial omens. This form of astrology, as it appears in the tablets, was focused on practical predictions, mundane topics like weather forecasts or political forecasts. So astrology in Babylon was used to make predictions, but also as a very practical tool to establish yearly calendars for communities with the list of tasks they should accomplish at each moment of the year: harvesting, fishing, sowing crops, collecting or managing water reserves, things like that. It seems there was no clear distinction between the predictive function of astrology and the yearly calendar, which is more a timekeeping, very practical thing. The Babylonians were limited in their astronomical knowledge, which was not the most advanced of their time. It was only 1,000 years later, in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, that they started accurately calculating, predicting future planetary positions. The positions of planets that were visible to the naked eye, obviously, such as Jupiter, Venus, Mars or Mercury. Saturn was also known. At this point, they started producing ephemerides, that is to say, diaries or books, but they were on tablets, not on paper, that gave the future trajectory of astronomical objects. Ephemerides were crucial to make elaborate astrological predictions, to know where planets were in the past when a person was born, or an event happened, and to be able to anticipate where planets would be at a given time in the future. It is believed the Babylonians associated planets with their gods, and they saw astrology as a way to understand or anticipate what divine forces would expect from them, how to please or to appease them. With the multiplication of ephemerides, their astrology also became more individualized, with predictions about people and no longer just meteorological trends or predictions about politics and the whole of society. They started making horoscopes, which means a visual representation of the heavens at a given time, and with them natal astrology, the concept that remains central in modern Western astrology, that an individual's personality or path of life can be explained and anticipated, at least for a part, depending on the situation of the sky at the moment of the person's birth. This belief that astrology can make predictions about individuals and not just social, political, or meteorological events was also present in ancient Indian and Chinese astrology. But as we see with the case of the Babylonians, it appeared after the creation of an astrological system, at least a millennium after in the case of Babylon. They didn't have enough astronomical knowledge to establish horoscopes and birth charts before the 5th century BC. Babylon also established in the first half of the first millennium BC the tradition to divide the sky into signs, into zodiac signs, named after constellations. The mapping of the visible sky happened before and in various parts of the world. For example, we know from Egyptian tombs that the Egyptians from the 2nd millennium BC already had divided the night sky into segments or decans. They had 36 of them, and they were identified by the group of stars that appeared inside each of them, providing like a background in the sky, slowly moving along the year, in which faster bodies, planets, moved. These segments were called decans because they are 10 degrees wide, so you have 36 of them. That's 360 degrees in total, representing the entire landscape of the sky that passed above them during a year. To the Egyptians, these decans were like a coordinate system. When something was observed in the sky, they could note, record, and communicate the information. The Babylonians also had such maps of the sky, but by the 5th or 4th century BC, they had divided the visible celestial sphere into 12 sections, each of 30 degrees, like the 12 months of the year, and they had attributed a sign to each of them. This happened as they were developing birth charts and horoscopes. And so, from an astrological standpoint, people were born under a particular sign, depending on the position of the sun in the visible sky, the ecliptic, at the moment of their birth. This sign, plus the individual position of planets within the zodiac at the moment of birth, provided as many individualized influences that could explain a person's personality or destiny. As you see, many principles of Western astrology were elaborated, invented by the Babylonians. And then they traveled to the Greco-Roman world, to the west, and to India also, to the east. I will tell you later about Indian astrology, but before that, let's look at what happened in the Mediterranean, more specifically in Egypt. By the end of the 6th century BC, the Babylonians conquered Egypt, which at this point was well past its glorious days of independence and stability. But Egypt was still rich. It had a large population and a vibrant culture. Part of this culture was its astrological tradition. We don't know in details how the Egyptian astrological system worked, but astrologers were present. The ecliptic had been mapped into sections, into decans that I just mentioned, and astrology was used as a divination method. For example, before battles, or to name newborns from the aristocracy, astrologers in Egypt had been consulted for centuries. It is believed that this Babylonian occupation influenced a great deal Egyptian astrology, even though it didn't last very long. For example, in the naming of zodiac signs. So it left a big trace, and 200 years later, Alexander the Great invaded Egypt, taking it from the Persians who had replaced the Babylonians. Egypt became the place where different great cultures, different big influences mixed the most. Egyptian, Babylonian, Persian, Greek. When it came to astrology, a synthesis came out of it that included the Babylonian tradition of zodiac signs, named after constellations, the Egyptian tradition of subdividing the ecliptic into 36 decans of 10 degrees, which cut each zodiac sign into 3 subsections, 3 decans, and the significance that the Greeks had given to the various planets they knew. These different takes on astrology merged and laid the basis of Western astrology. In the 2nd century AD, they were synthesized in a book by a scholar called Claudius Ptolemy, who was at the same time a mathematician, astronomer, astrologer, and geographer. This book, the Tetrabiblos, was translated from Greek to Arabic, which ensured its preservation, then to Latin during the Middle Ages, almost 1,000 years after it had been written, and it became a kind of Bible, the main reference for European astrologers for centuries. As in many other cultural and intellectual fields, Greece influenced Rome, and in the first centuries of our era, the kind of astrology that dominated around the Mediterranean was this synthesis of Babylonian, Egyptian, and Greek beliefs. It was still different from modern Western astrology because less planets were known, the calculations of their positions were less precise than they would become, but overall the concepts of zodiac signs, named after constellations, the belief that someone's astrological profile depended on the time and place of birth in relation to the position of astronomical objects, all of this was already in place. Both Greek and Roman societies had an ambivalent view of astrology. It was popular, as other means of divination were, probably not as much as oracles, but in the lower classes of society that did not have access to oracles or seers, astrology could work as a substitute. It made its way up in society, and some Roman emperors started to consult astrologers for guidance. But it doesn't mean astrology was always embraced. It was also criticized. First, because it remained seen as a foreign practice, especially by the Romans. They knew it came from the East, that it was not genuinely Roman. And there was an ongoing current in the Roman elite that was constantly preoccupied by the possible contamination or the decline of Romanity due to foreign influences. Even though the Romans tolerated foreign cults, beliefs, and languages, most educated Romans of the first or the second centuries saw their culture, their political tradition, their military, or their social order as superior to anything else. And why wouldn't they, since they had been very successful? But as their empire expanded and Roman citizens multiplied, there was always the fear that what made Rome could be diluted and become decadent, that the values of bravery, sacrifice, honor, high morality, or efficacy that were seen as inherently Roman would get lost. So even at the height of Roman power and Roman influence, there were authors condemning foreign influences of all kinds, from the importation of exotic luxury goods that was suspected to soften the Romans, to alien religions, beliefs, or practices, like astrology. Astrology was still associated with Babylon and Egypt. It was often referred to as Chaldean wisdom, Chaldea being the name given to Babylonia, to Mesopotamia. So astrologers were sometimes attacked in writings. They were called charlatans. The main argument being used against them was that there was no proof that what they said was accurate. The Greeks and the Romans did not have something comparable to the modern scientific method, but they distinguished analogical and deductive reasoning. astrology was and still is analogical. This means it works purely on comparisons, but cannot explain why it works. Astrologers claimed that having a planet in a particular position at birth or at a given moment had a certain influence, but they could not explain how or why. They could only say it was as it was because it had been observed before. There is no logical, deductive relation here. And so different Roman thinkers pointed this, arguing that they were asked to believe something said by someone who could not even explain it, nor come up with evidence that it had been observed. Maybe it was just made up after all. The same thinkers could accept unproven beliefs when they were part of their own cultural traditions, but not from some alien culture that they considered somewhat decadent. The same arguments for or against astrology are still around. Astrology lost its recognition as a science because it cannot explain how or why it would work, and it cannot demonstrate that it statistically works. This is why we can speak of analogical reasoning here, the belief that an observation implies an effect, but without an understanding of how the two are related. This is what superstitions are made of. A very basic example of analogical reasoning could be, I have observed that it rained during the past 3 Fridays, so that must mean that Friday brings rain. But before we judge, we also need to acknowledge that analogical reasoning plays a big role in the human thought processes. It is because we make comparisons and start from observations that we can elaborate hypotheses, and that helps us a lot navigate daily life, even without necessarily deeply understanding everything that happens around us. We absolutely need analogies. Another analogy, for example, could be that when there are clouds, rain follows. And this one is a fruitful analogy, the first step towards understanding where rain comes from. So, without the analogical thought process, without the capability to make that kind of comparisons, we would have a hard time making hypotheses and questioning them. But still, analogical reasoning is generally less convincing than deductive reasoning. That is to say, a form of reasoning that is able to logically explain why and how things happen as they do. A contemporary reaction to this argumentative weakness of astrology is to speak of supposed energies sent by celestial bodies that would reach us and provide this logical link between planets or celestial configurations and our states of mind or circumstances. This concept of energies provides a causality, but maybe not a very convincing one, because the term energy here is still undefined. It is not energy in the sense of physics. It was never measured or quantified. It is seen as immaterial. It is more a synonym for influence. That sounds a bit more sciencey or tangible than the term influence. But it is still purely conceptual. No one has ever explained or measured what this supposed energy was, or how astrology was able to anticipate on it. Even though they were not formulated in scientific terms, These objections to astrology were already raised 2000 years ago. But this being said, beware of thinking that these anti-astrology Roman authors were rigorous scientists. In the case of most of them, like Cicero, but there were many others, it seems their opposition to astrology was much more motivated by the visceral rejection of a foreign practice that bothered them, rather than by a love of logic and science. At the same time, they also defended Roman beliefs and traditions that were not rooted in logic and reasoning at all. But in practice, this didn't stop astrology from spreading and appealing to all social classes. Remember that at the time, astrology and astronomy were not clearly separated fields. As a matter of fact, many scholars did both. And this tells us that there was no widespread rejection of astrology by the scholarly world. Like for alchemy and chemistry, alchemy being the more esoterical ancestor of scientific chemistry, astrology and astronomy were hard to distinguish, and they probably mutually stimulated each other. Demand for astrology gave an incentive to come up with better calculations of the movement of celestial objects. It also stimulated the elaboration of theories about the nature of the cosmos and this mysterious dome above people's heads. In that sense, the concern for astrology was certainly fruitful in terms of discoveries upon which future generations would build. The absence of clear separation between astronomy and astrology continued until the dawn of modern times, including in universities, until astronomy separated itself from astrology, when it appeared that Earth was maybe not the center of the universe, and that all the mapping of the sky and the hypothesis medieval astrology was built on were challenged by a completely different representation of the world, in which Earth was also a body traveling in space like all the other planets and stars we can see. But we will come back to this. Before I tell you about astrology in the Middle Ages, let's go back east and to America to see how different astrological systems emerged in China, in India, or in Mesoamerica. As all these developments took place in the Middle East and the Mediterranean, another region of the world where astronomy and astrology had an advanced development was in China. Chinese astrology was elaborated in the first millennium BC, about at the same time as the Babylonian, Egyptian, Greek synthesis happened 2000 years ago. A number of principles were set in China. Principles that are rather different from Western astrology. First, because Chinese astrology was infused with traditional principles or beliefs from Chinese culture, the yin-yang philosophy, that is to say, the belief in two opposite and complementary principles, the theory of the five elements, metal, wood, water, fire and earth, or the concept of heaven and earth. The Chinese also associated the planets they knew with elements, not with deities like in the Greco-Roman world. Venus was associated with metal, Jupiter with wood, Mercury with water, Mars with fire, and Saturn with earth. Chinese astrology was, and still is, based on a mapping of the sky, but the constellations are different, and there are not the same zodiac signs that divide the year into 12 segments. Instead, Chinese astronomers divided the celestial circle into 12 sections, following the orbit of Jupiter. Jupiter needs about 12 years to complete a revolution around the Sun, so 12 years, in reality a bit less, is the duration of a year for Jupiter. So Chinese zodiac signs are associated with periods of 1 year, and they are also different from Western zodiac signs: dragon, tiger, horse, monkey. So the system is very different, but Chinese astrology had the same functions as its Western counterpart. There was mundane astrology that told of seasons and events that impacted all of society, like what I told you about Babylon, all the way to birth astrology, with the same belief that a person's fate and character could be influenced by the position of the major planets at the person's birth, along with the position of the sun, the moon, the place of birth, and their zodiac signs, which in that case is determined by the year when they were born, and not a period during the year. The division of the sky into segments is something that happened spontaneously in other parts of the world, between cultures that were not in contact. We also see it in Mesoamerica. As you may know, Mesoamerican cultures, like the Maya, the Olmecs, the Toltecs, the Aztecs, had an advanced astronomical knowledge. In the first millennium BC, they had identified and rather precisely estimated the solar year. They could also anticipate on the course of planets, and they had elaborate calendars. If we take the Maya as an example, they had a solar calendar of 360 days that is believed to have been essentially practical. It was used for the planting of crops and other domestic matters. But they also had a ritual or religious calendar of 260 days. It was shorter, and this one governed rites, ceremonies, offering to their gods, festivals. They also tracked the cycle of Venus, a 584 days cycle that followed the course of Venus. To the Greeks and Romans, because Venus had been associated with the goddess of love and beauty, the planet was generally seen as a positive astrological influence, or at least one that governed intimate feelings and love life. To the Maya, Venus was much more sinister in a sense. It was believed to be inauspicious and bringer of violence. So the rising of Venus at the beginning of this 584-day cycle would be preferably chosen to start wars, to engage in confrontation in general. The Maya also named constellations after animals. They are not all known, but it seems at least some of their constellations were common with other separate cultures. like the constellation of Gemini that they called Peccary, or Scorpio that they also called the Scorpion. Yet another major region in the world that developed an astrological system was India. And India was influenced by and also influenced Mesopotamia and China. India was another place of astronomical excellence in the ancient world, and astrology built on this. But the origins and influences that led to modern Indian astrology are a bit unclear, because a lot of texts from the first centuries of our era got lost. The first known astrology text in Sanskrit is from the 2nd century AD, and it was translated from Greek. And indeed, many aspects of Indian astrology keep traces of this Greek influence. There are the same zodiac signs, each associated with one of the 4 elements, for example. But there are also other concepts that appear to be specifically Indian. For example, on top of the 12 zodiac signs, the sky is also divided into 27 segments called lunar mansions. The system also considers 9 celestial bodies, but they are not exactly the same as in Western astrology. After the discovery of new planets that were not visible without telescopes, Western astrology updated its system. Typically, it includes Uranus or Neptune, sometimes dwarf planets like Ceres. The Indian system focuses on planets that have been known for thousands of years: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, plus the Sun and the Moon, which accounts for 3. There is the whole body, but also its south node and its north node. Node here refers to the position of the moon in its cycle. The north node is when the moon is rising, for half of the lunar month, and the south node is the aspect of the moon when it is descending. The body of Indian astrology, as it is still in use today, was fixed in texts from the early medieval period, the 6th to 8th centuries AD. At the same time, to the west of India, Middle Eastern and Greek astrology were adopted by Islamic scholars. So let's take a look at that too. As soon as the expansion of Islam began in the 7th century, Arab scholars, who most of the time knew Greek too, began to translate and circulate Greek and Latin writings in every field, including astronomy and astrology. They expanded this knowledge from antiquity. For example, in the field of astronomy, they identified and named many stars. A lot of stars have names that come from Arabic, like Aldebaran, Altair, Betelgeuse, or Vega. And they also applied their mathematical skills to astrology. For example, to develop the calculation of angles between celestial bodies and include them into horoscopes. Astrology in the medieval Islamic world was very well established. Monarchs would consult astrologers, and the discipline had its place in libraries and universities. But it doesn't mean astrology was accepted by everyone here again. Several prominent astronomers and mathematicians or thinkers wrote against it for different reasons. One reason was the old objection to astrology that already existed centuries earlier about its purely empirical nature. Astrologers claimed that a given celestial configuration would produce certain effects, but they could not tell why or how they knew it. There had been no experiment, no proof. And some authors just argued that it could be completely invented. Interestingly, the idea that planets and other bodies acted on terrestrial life was not really discussed or argued against. It was admitted as something likely. What these authors attacked, like Avicenna, one of the most prominent philosophers of medieval Islam, who was also a physician and believed in proof-based knowledge, what they contested or doubted was the capability of astrologers to determine the exact influence of stars and planets. Avicenna believed that astrologers knew nothing and just repeated what others had invented before them, taking it as knowledge when in fact it had been made up. So Avicenna and others did not deny the essential dogma of astrology, the belief that celestial bodies have an influence on human life. What he denied was our ability to make predictions from astrology. Another kind of critique was more of a theological nature. Orthodox Islamic scholars argued that the will of God could not be precisely known or predicted in advance when it came to the lives of individuals or small groups, and that it was arrogant, almost blasphematory, to pretend to be able to predict the future. We will see in a minute that a similar argument also existed in Christianity. The Catholic Church rejected astrology. But in Muslim regions during the Middle Ages, these critics were around, and astrology was a bit controversial. But because it remained very associated with astronomy, and because it was also used to make meteorological forecasts, or even in medicine, it was considered by many as part of the natural sciences of the time. And apart from these theoretical debates, the point is that there was demand and fascination for astrology. It was popular, so it was abundantly practiced and written about. At the same time, in medieval Europe, which was predominantly Christian, and more as the Middle Ages advanced, astrology also went on. Marginally in the first centuries of the Middle Ages, because antique astronomical knowledge had been lost in this part of the world. The intellectual and scholarly world was very fragmented, so it is likely that astrology was still practiced by a few people, but probably in an unsophisticated form. Another thing that didn't play in favor of astrology, too, was that the Church condemned it as superstition. In practice, it was not repressed or fought very aggressively. Few astrologers were really bothered by the Church, unless they would become vocal about other theories or beliefs seen as heretical, and in that case, the practice of astrology could be held against them as a sign of deviance or blasphemy. So the Church was hostile, but it didn't stop astrology from existing and even prospering, as the Middle Ages advanced. In the 12th and 13th centuries, different texts were translated from Arabic, ancient Greek treatises, or the writings of Muslim astrologers and astronomers who had built up on them. And this was not limited to astrology, by the way. In many other fields, Arabic manuscripts or Greek manuscripts from Byzantium permitted medieval Europe to rediscover and reappropriate antique science, philosophy, and antique beliefs too. As the first European universities opened when they were founded after the 10th century, astrology that was paired with astronomy became one of the areas taught at the same level as arithmetic, geometry, or rhetoric. And we have plenty of signs that astrology was very present in medieval culture, from educated to modest classes. For example, medieval writers often used astrological symbolism with zodiac signs and planets in their literary themes. Many of them speak of astrology in a way that assumes a certain knowledge of their readers about it. We also have the precious archives of an English astrologer of the 15th century, Richard Trewithion, that include a notebook with his list of clients. This list shows people from all walks of life, not just wealthy or educated people, suggesting that consulting with an astrologer was a widespread practice by the end of the Middle Ages. One field where astrology played a big role was medicine. By the 13th century, using astrology was a part of everyday medical practice in Christian Europe. To become a physician with official diploma and recognition, one had to know enough astrology, enough to use the position of stars, planets, and the moon as important information in a diagnosis or to decide a treatment. By the 1500s, it was even compulsory in many countries to calculate the position of the moon before any complicated procedure, like surgery. These procedures had to be done at the right time, with the right celestial influences on the patient side. And maybe the peak of European astrology was in the 16th century, at the time of the Renaissance. Coming out of the Middle Ages, astrology had a high profile already. Astronomical knowledge from Greco-Roman antiquity had been fully recovered and even perfected. And astrology benefited from its association with astronomy that gave it like a veneer of fact-based, credible science. At the time, all kings or high aristocrats, powerful people, consulted astrologers. Ephemerides and horoscopes were widely distributed using printing press and reaching more people than ever. This was the century of Nostradamus. I made a story about him if you are curious. Nostradamus' books of predictions were sold like this, and these were some of the best sellers of the Renaissance. And yet, problems were about to begin for astrology in the West. Astrology was dealt a big blow when it started to be rejected by astronomers, as the antique worldview collapsed. Until the Renaissance, as you know, the geocentric theory that put Earth at the center of the universe had not been questioned seriously. It was even more unquestionable that it had also become official teaching from the Church. The dominating theory about the structure of the universe dated from very long ago, from ancient Greece, Aristotle. In Aristotelian physics, there were several spheres, and Earth was one of them. Above our heads were two other spheres, the sublunar realm, including the sky above our heads up to the moon, and the celestial realm beyond the moon, where stars and planets evolved. Astrology had completely embraced this model. All its calculations and principles were based on it, bound to it. But in a few decades, it appeared that Earth was just a planet among others, that there were more planets or celestial bodies than thought until now, for example, the moons of Jupiter, that maybe it was the Sun that was at the center. That's the heliocentric theory of Copernicus. And so that all the principles of astrology, with its limited numbers of known planets, the Sun revolving around the Earth, the stars forming constellations that are just our perception of them from where we stand, but in fact the stars from the same constellation can be at very different distances from us. They appear grouped just because they are in the same sector of the sky. All of this stopped more and more astronomers from taking astrology seriously, because they knew that all its assumptions since antiquity no longer stood. It doesn't mean the concept of astrology was fully rejected yet. That is to say, the concept that stars and planets interfered in terrestrial life. The problem was more the realization that the astrological system that had been in use for so long was built on a description that no longer was scientifically accurate, a model that could no longer stay associated with astronomy. The separation of the two fields did not happen quickly, though. It took place in stages along the 17th and 18th centuries. Possibly because many astronomers were also astrologers. And I'm not talking of obscure scholars, people like Galileo, Kepler, Tycho Brahe, who are some of the most prominent astronomers of the Renaissance and early modern period, and even of history. People who made major discoveries also practiced astrology. Another possible reason is that when this revolution in the conception of the universe happened, it was very destabilizing. It transformed the vision of the world from a finite, familiar model that put Earth and mankind at the center into one of unprecise limits, unprecise boundaries. Where did this immensity ended, if it did? In which men were traveling in space on a planet that was no different from other planets. Not a comforting thought. So there was probably reluctance to let the old Aristotelian model go. And until the 18th century, astrology was not heavily criticized or rejected outside of universities, because in universities it was now considered out of place. And in stages it was ousted. This meant that, contrary to what happened in the previous centuries, there was no longer much intellectual investment put into astrology, and the system was not reinvented. It could have been conceivable, when the Copernican revolution happened, that astrology would have reset itself. We saw that around the world, from China to Mesoamerica, there had been different takes on astrology, different approaches to it. The basic belief or assumption is that celestial objects interfere with terrestrial life. Not that there are zodiac signs or that every planet has a particular influence that would be fixed once and for all. So astrology could have reinvented itself to absorb all this new information about the distances, the nature of celestial objects, the new planets discovered, the realization that the Sun was a star among many. But it only partially happened, and away from universities, from the academic, scholarly world. Partially because, as I said before, a few other planets were added and attributed an influence. But the rest of the system was left unchanged, or only marginally adapted. This reinvention probably did not happen because time had changed too. Analogical reasoning was no longer accepted as knowledge, in a scientific sense of fact-based, proven knowledge. And because astrology could not explain why or how it worked, because it could not show statistical proof of efficacy, it had lost its academic credibility. From the 18th century to our day, there is no shortage of critics that point the absence of proof. The fact that astrology utilizes calculations or principles of astronomy that once were astronomically correct, but not anymore, or that it doesn't take into account many celestial bodies, that it has a very simplified version of space in which only objects that are visible and constellations that are arbitrary are taken into account. And yet, the expulsion of astrology from universities and mainstream science did not make it disappear. Astrology flew under the radar during the 19th century. It was still there, but with little representation in literature or the media. And since the 20th century, it has come back in force in popular culture, with horoscopes in the press and probably more astrologers than ever. Even though nowadays they no longer do any astronomical calculations. They use ephemerides in books or ready-to-use in software to make their predictions. The fact that astrology survived so well suggests that maybe it is not about science or a rational demonstration of its merits. Why do people still believe, or at least like to have fun and seek advice with astrology? Maybe part of it is because it is comforting. Not just because it offers predictions and explanations about what happens in our lives, but also because of the worldview it is built on. Astrology brings us to a finite world, a projection in which there is a limited number of bodies traveling in a space confined to a few constellations, a big space, but it can be grasped, and one can become familiar with it. There are rules, but they can be learned or understood. This is much more reassuring and familiar than thinking of a limitless space with billions of bodies, and the absurdity of living on one of them, traveling at thousands of miles per hour in space, somewhere in the margins of a galaxy. Modern astronomy can be fascinating, but also anxiety-inducing. This could be said of modern science and technology in general too. So there is probably something appealing in astrology as a system. It is closed. It claims to make sense of things that seem to happen randomly. Psychologically, it takes what looks like chaos and replaces it with order and meaning. Even more, when it takes individual responsibility away from people, at least for a part, by suggesting that what happens to them or how they feel is under external influences. Another appeal of astrology is that it is individualized somewhat. The horoscope published in a magazine, not that much, but birth charts also provide an unique astrological profile to each person. It tells you at the same time that you are unique and that you belong to something. Maybe it is not a coincidence that astrology is growing hand in hand with the wellness industry. Another hypothesis is that it is a reflection of anxiety in society. Astrology experienced a spike in popularity in the 1970s. There seems to be another one now. This could be linked to a higher share of the population looking for answers and at the same time willing to find comfort in a worldview that has been around for a long time. So long that people don't even question it that much. Even fans of astrology generally don't know or think much about where the zodiac comes from, how it was put in place, by whom. And indeed, as we have seen tonight, it is very old, more than 2000 years old. I hope this little historical tour interested you and that you could learn a few things. This is the end of our story for tonight. I will be back soon with another one. And in the meantime, sleep well, sweet dreams, au revoir.